Welcome everyone to my presentation on my study on um, long-term care residents' lived experience of fear of retaliation when they consider voicing care concerns or filing mistreatment complaints. So this is actually the topic of, this is actually the title of a report that came out in June 2023, which is called They Make You Pay: How Fear of Retaliation Silences Residents in America's Nursing Homes, which was funded and produced by the Long-Term Care Community Coalition, um, which is a great organization without regards. It's also based on my journal article that I published shortly later in the Journal of Applied Gerontology. So you can see here the abstract, and also you can see here a link to a podcast that I gave about the study. The study also received media coverage with USA Today. And last year, the National Consumer Voice for Quality Long-Term Care developed and published a fact sheet on this issue of fear of retaliation and retaliation. So I'm including it here for you as a resource you may find useful. So I want to acknowledge, again, the Long-Term Care Community Coalition, or LTCCC, with the Executive Director Richard Molot and Eric Goldwyn and Haley Cronquist for their support of this line of work and the production of this very impactful report. I also want to thank Mairead Painter, Connecticut Long-Term Care Ombudsman, who supports this line of work and for her insight into this project. And of course, state surveyors across the country. Without their hard work and dedicated work, this study would not have been possible because it is based on investigation reports from across the country. And I want to also thank folks at the Nursing Home Inspect ProPublica website who created a very important data set from which I retrieved those investigation reports. We're going to talk about a lot of negative and disturbing things that are happening in the context of this phenomenon. But before we do, I want to recognize that I believe that most CNAs and nurses are caring and dedicated. As one very professional CNA said years ago, we love working with the residents. It gives us joy that we can assist them in the evening of their lives. We truly care for the residents. And that honest care shows in the work that we do. And this is a piece that I hand carved, recognizing individuals working in long-term care homes for their hard work. They're really the foundation of care. So here's a definition of fear: an unpleasant, often strong emotion caused by anticipation or awareness of danger. Here's one definition of fear of retaliation: a concern or feeling of vulnerability that one's actions may cause retaliation by another. Definition of retaliation: an actual or perceived negative reaction of a person as a result of another person's action or behavior. Here is another definition of retaliation from the National Ombudsman Reporting System: acts of retaliation or revenge by staff in response to complaint to the care home, ombudsman program, or the state survey agency. Or as Ronnie, who was a nursing home resident in Connecticut, said, fear of retaliation is not something you can look up in a dictionary, but if you live in a setting where you depend on others to care for you, you know exactly what it is. And she said it as part of a powerful educational video called Voices Speak Out Against Retaliation that came out in 2010. And I should say that while it's very effective, it needs to be updated. Related to that, Hawaii State Long-Term Care Ombudsman John McDermott discovered the issue of fear of retaliation when he started the job in 1985. In the middle of the night, there's a nurse aide who doesn't like her and comes when she's asleep and throws the blanket off and throws it on the floor. And John asked her, "You saw that happen?" And the resident said, "Oh yeah, many times." Why didn't you say anything?" he asked her. And she just looked at me and said, "You've never lived in a nursing home, have you?" This phenomena of retaliation against residents is not new. For example, in a government report from 2001, a resident in an Ohio nursing home sustained severe lacerations on the ear, skin tears, and bruising on his neck and hands. When asked by staff who did it to him, he said, "He'll beat me again. He'll beat me up again if I tell you." Later, he identified a male aide who confessed to abusing him. Here's a incident that occurred in Minnesota. In response for asking for her medications, a nurse came and slammed the phone against her chest so hard she almost passed out. Uh, After her complaint to the state was not adequately addressed, she said, "This is why no one knows about these crimes. It's not because we don't have a voice. It's because people in power deliberately choose not to listen." So how common fear of retaliation? Well, one early survey conducted by Atlanta Long-Term Care Ombudsman Program found that 44% of residents who witnessed abuse of other residents did not report it. Half of these individuals did not report it due to fear of retaliation. In a Yukon study led by Professor Julie Robinson, she conducted a study and a survey in different types of long-term care homes. And when the question was asked in nursing homes, "Do you worry about retaliation if you were to report a complaint or concern?" 23% of residents worried about retaliation if they were to report a complaint or concern. In that study, one resident said, "Yes, I heard a girl say that they know how to get even, so I try to keep my mouth shut." Another resident said, "Oh yeah, always. That's why nobody makes a complaint. The administrator scares everyone, and he is very belittling and yells at people." Another resident said, "Yes, there's a lot of retaliation." Other findings from that Yukon study. Several residents completed in-depth interviews. Based on these interviews, the researchers found that some instances of retaliation are egregious, but others are more subtle in nature. Many forms of retaliation may not even be recognized by residents or staff. And worry about potential retaliation was just as fearsome for some residents as the experience of retaliation itself. Those residents who felt conflicted about whether or not to report retaliation said that they felt hopelessness and despair. The study concluded that retaliation and fear of retaliation is a reality in any supportive housing situation. Now, we know that fear of retaliation is a strong and persistent and long-standing barrier for reporting right violations, care concerns, and different forms of mistreatment. The National Long-Term Care Ombudsman Resource Center stated in 2018, "Fear of retaliation is one of the most common reasons residents do not want to pursue a complaint and disclose their identity. Since residents live in a care home and rely on staff for their basic needs, their fear of retaliation cannot be overemphasized." And Professor David Grabowski from Harvard Medical School said, in reaction to my study, "Residents' fears could be a factor leading to underestimating neglect or abuse." Investigative reporter Chris Sears, formerly with the Star Tribune, who investigated this issue in long-term care homes, wrote, "The threat of retaliation not only terrifies residents, it discourages them and their families from taking steps that would protect their rights or enforce public regulations. So from here on, I'm going to talk about the study that I conducted. The goal of the study was to identify the circumstances surrounding and manifestations of 5 aspects. The first one is residents' fear of staff retaliation, that lived experience, often in their own words. The second aspect is residents' allegations of staff threats of retaliation, residents' perceptions of staff retaliation. The fourth aspect is actual or confirmed staff retaliation. And the last and fifth aspect is emotional and psychological consequences of those 4 aspects listed above. The overarching goals of the study was to raise awareness to this phenomenon, was to call for policy, practice, and research action to address it. And I should say that the study did not aim to identify solutions to this challenge. Many strategies are described in my report, A Bridge Over Scary Water, which was published in December 2024, and for which I'm going to dedicate a separate presentation for this annual conference of the Colorado Long-Term Care Ombudsman Program 2025. Another concern is that this phenomenon is not tracked by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services in over 15,000 nursing homes nationwide. It's also not being tracked in terms of complaints in the NORS system, National Ombudsman Resource System, related to fear retaliation. This system does track retaliation with complaint code DO6. But let's remember that in federally regulated nursing homes, residents have a right to express care concerns and file mistreatment complaints, not only without retaliation, but also without fear of retaliation. So when we're not tracking fear of retaliation, we are missing a lot of right violations and, frankly, suffering of residents and a barrier for reporting. So sometimes researchers cannot wait for data sets to be created and become accessible. More importantly, residents and families can't wait. So the data for this study, I retrieved it from the Nursing Home Inspect ProPublica website, which draws completed and de-identified investigation reports from the Nursing Home Care Compare website, or what used to be called Nursing Home Compare. And I identified 835 standard surveys and complaint investigation reports with the word retaliation in it. And I went one by one and narrowed it down to 100 standard surveys and complaint investigation reports. They were completed between 2017 and 2022. Those 100 investigations were conducted in 100 nursing homes in 30 states. I excluded the following investigations: those that had to do with family fear of staff retaliation, staff fear of retaliation, whether it's from supervisors, managers, coworkers, resident-to-resident retaliation, and reports containing the word retaliation, but no relevant information beyond it. So here I'm going to share, I'm just going to take a pause here for a second and touch on the issue of family fear of retaliation, because it is very, very important. And yet it wasn't the primary focus of the report, A Bridge Over Scary Water, and not of the study that I'm reporting here in this presentation today. What is needed is urgently, we need research studies on the experience of family fear of retaliation in different long-term care settings. And again, from the report, A Bridge Over Scary Water, one ombudsman said, I hold family councils where this topic comes up a lot, that fear of retaliation. Another said, it's a real fear. It is natural for a lot of families to bring that up. Another said, the families fear of complaining because they're afraid their loved ones be retaliated, so they're reluctant to complain. Families are afraid they're going to get their loved ones kicked out or receive poor care. Like the care is just going to get worse if I complain. One ombudsman said that one family told them they basically said they wouldn't even let me wear my badge going into their bedroom because they didn't want anyone knowing that I was coming in to see them. So it's a big and fairly common issue that we need to study and pay more attention to. In one nursing home, a adult child told the ombudsman, "They are overdosing my mom. She's not responsive anymore." The ombudsman said, "Okay, well, can I advocate on her behalf?" The family said, "Absolutely not." 2 hours later, the family calls again. "Mom is not responsive anymore." The ombudsman said, "Okay, can I do anything? Can I help you?" The family said no. The ombudsman um, said or reflected on this um, incident by saying, "Well, how much worse can it get?" She added, "We want to do something, but they are so afraid." Um, Also, with regards to family councils, several ombudsmen spoke about the importance of family councils in addressing care concerns, fear retaliation, and actual retaliation. This really deserves a whole different, you know, attention in research and best practices. However, ombudsmen also identify challenges in forming and running family councils. One of them said it's like pulling teeth to get a family council started. And another ombudsman said a lot of nursing homes don't have a family council. So I just wanted to kind of put a brief kind of spotlight on this issue that deserves more attention. And then there's staff fear retaliation. So staff members may witness neglect or abuse or retaliation, but they may be very afraid to report it, whether it's due to fear of disciplinary action or losing their job, etc. So you can watch here another webinar that I gave on this issue of staff fear retaliation, which is based on another report that I did on this issue. You can find it on this slide. We also should know that there are lawsuits against nursing homes when they retaliated against staff who witness and report abuse. There's a couple of examples here about a whistleblower in Iowa where an aide was fired, and then a jury awarded $5.2 million to a nurse who was fired after reporting abuse in that care setting. Going back to the study at the center of this presentation. So every one of the 100 investigation reports that I examined, I created a template with which I systematically examined each investigation. And each investigation was summarized into one page with a title that captures the essence of what happened there, the deficient practice statement as described by the surveyor, brief background about residents impacted when detail was provided, and summary of relevant evidence, background about the nursing home, the name of the nursing home, the date the investigation was completed, type of deficiency issued, the scope severity level determined, overall quality star rating, and staffing ratings. So from here on, I'm going to describe the findings of my research study. The study again focused on residents' lived experience and oftentimes in residents' words. I identified a total of 240 residents were found to experience fear of retaliation, and this is a conservative estimate. Here I'm going to share a series of quotes that were expressed by residents. One resident said, "I prefer to stay quiet to prevent retaliation. I'm afraid they are going to retaliate against me. They make you pay. No matter what you say, they will make you pay for it. Can't say their names, don't want to pay the price." Another said, "They will come at me. It backfires on you. Residents get chewed at when a concern is voiced. I feel like I'm retaliated against when I complain." Another resident said, "You did not want to be on the wrong side when you went off. I was worried that she would try to kill me by over-medicating me. It was like she was out for blood. This was a medication aid that described retaliatory verbal abuse by a CNA." And an employee who witnessed cruel retaliatory physical abuse by a coworker said that they never saw such evil. A blind resident was put through hell for reporting incorrect dose of blood pressure medication. Another resident said, "If I told you what she has done to me, she would just make my life worse." Another resident said, "I didn't like to complain because it would come back to haunt me. The staff would retaliate. They would just gang up on you like a pack of wolves. Oh, it will come back on me. It would be abusive. It would be bad. She would figure out a way where I couldn't defend myself." Another resident said, "I felt threatened for my life." A resident said that they were terrified of being evicted and felt powerless and helpless. Another resident said, "This is my home. I do not want to live here, and I fear retaliation." Here are a couple of conversations between residents and state surveyors. "I'm literally afraid of her. She intimidates. Are you sure nothing's going to happen to me?" Another resident said, "What am I supposed to do when you leave? I still must live here. I don't want to talk anymore." Speaking with an ombudsman, the ombudsman asked, "How come you won't let us address these things?" The resident replied, "You get to go home. I have to stay here all weekend. And once you go home, everything changes." Excuse me. During an interview with a state surveyor, a resident said that an aide pulled a mechanical lift harness roughly behind her. The resident did not report it because they were afraid of retaliation. She did tell her family to stay quiet about it. She said, "You have to be careful of what you say around here. It will come back to you." When asked if she has ever been hurt, she wouldn't answer. She turned her head to the door and said, "They are out there. They are listening to everything." When her family spoke, she said, "You don't understand. You have to keep your mouth shut." Here I'm moving to kind of a high-level overview of the findings related to the first aspect examined in the study, which is the lived experience of fear retaliation. Many residents were convinced that the reporting on right violations, poor care, and mistreatment will result in retaliation. Fearful, some terrified for their safety if they were to speak up about care concerns and mistreatment. Many chose to remain anonymous when reporting concerns and mistreatment to employees and state surveyors. Some chose not to identify the alleged perpetrators for fear of retaliation. Others chose not to speak at all about the violations of their rights, care, and mistreatment. In this case, a resident said, "I felt threatened for my life." An employee said about this resident, "She kept saying she felt threatened. Her life was in danger due to physical abuse the night before. She did not report it due to fear of retaliation from the aide. To protect herself during the night, she kept a reacher by her side in the bed out of fear of the abusive aide." One resident said that the CNA slapped him on his head. He did not want to say anything about it because the CNA was bigger than him. Another resident was fearful after CNA allegedly wrung a towel soaked with hot water on her private parts. Some residents were so afraid of retaliation that they did not report mistreatment. They remained mistreated and neglected to avoid retaliation by a particular employee. For example, some residents stayed in soiled adult depends for hours, sometimes until the next shift, and sometimes until the morning shift came, only to avoid a particular employee. And as Ronnie, a nursing home resident in Connecticut, said years ago, fear is very powerful. It can paralyze some people to the point where they'll let just about anything happen without reporting it. Some residents in my study gave up trying to voice grievances after their grievances were continuously ignored or resulted in retaliation. One of them said, "Filing grievances was pointless as staff back each other up when asked about a situation and then become total terrors. An anonymous resident said that agency staff were too rough, mean, yelled at the resident and other residents, and did not care about the residents. The resident began to cry and felt like they just had to let things roll under the rug because it was just part of being in a nursing home. Speaking to the normalization of this phenomenon. The resident felt it did not do any good to tell anyone because they kept bringing more and more agency stuff. And if the residents did tell someone, the staff would just treat you worse. This resident knew that other residents felt the same way. And that if residents said anything about it, it just comes back on them. Mairead Painter, Connecticut long-term care ombudsman, said in an interview that I held with her, if you don't think anything is going to change and you don't see positive outcomes in any way, that's when people give up. Once people become hopeless, despair and hopelessness is when we see the most impact. That's what is most difficult for me to see residents going through. Fear of retaliation led to lack of reporting or delayed reporting of poor care and mistreatment. Right violations, poor care and mistreatment often remain uninvestigated, internally and externally. In several cases, alleged perpetrators were allowed to have continued access to fearful residents. Now think about it. You may remove this perpetrator from their residence assignment, but the resident may still see them in the dining room, in the activity area, in the hallway. And this particular perpetrator may still provide care to the roommate inside bedroom and bathroom. So the resident, the victim, may still see this same perpetrator. So one of the biggest things that came up in this study is the gross asymmetry of power and the specific context of resident fear of retaliation. We know about this power imbalance for decades in long-term care homes, but it has yet to be looked at in an in-depth manner in the context of fear of retaliation. Many residents were physically dependent on extensive staff assistance with activities of daily living, or ADLs. And interestingly, this is consistent with the early study that I mentioned by Julie Robinson from Yukon Center on Aging that found that residents with worse health were more likely to express fear of retaliation. It's also consistent with a review of dozens of studies that recognize this imbalance of power between residents not being able to draw attention on their experience of abuse and staff members probably not reporting abuse in order to protect themselves or their colleagues. So how do we balance that asymmetry of power? That's one of the biggest questions. Related to it, in my subsequent report, my recent report, A Bridge Over Scary Water, many ombudsmen spoke about physical dependency of residents as a key factor in fear of retaliation. One of them said, we feel the top one is their level of independence. We feel that if a resident is more independent, they're more willing to advocate for themselves and not to be as concerned about retaliation. As opposed to a resident who is pretty much 100% dependent on cares. They have a much higher fear of retaliation because they know if they upset someone, they might not get the cares that they need. So going back to the first group, the other residents know that if they upset someone, well, they can probably still do a lot of the cares because they're fairly independent. And I should say that for every trend in this report, there are also exceptions. Of course, there could be residents who are physically independent that are fearful of retaliation as well. Another ombudsman said that residents who are confined to their bed and are more vulnerable ones and defenseless are more fearful of retaliation. Moving on to the second aspect examined in this study, which is residents' allegations of staff threats of retaliation. Residents reported experiencing threats of retaliation, for example, threats to delay or not provide services and care, threats to neglect and abuse residents, threats of direct physical violence, threats of retaliation if the residents will report on being sexually abused, threats to discharge residents from the care home. And in one nursing home, a resident stated that staff threatened him or her and his or her roommate if they complained to the survey team. He or she said, once the surveyors were gone, things would go back to the way they were. Or threats to family members. One family member asked why their loved one had not been showered, and that why their teeth were not brushed, and why their loved one had their adult dependents soiled. In response, a CNA said, "You better not call state, or it will be worse for the resident." So picture a resident sitting in a nursing home calmly on Friday at 4 p.m. Without advance notice, residents were told, "We're moving you to an all-men secure care unit," against their will. If you refuse to move, well, the director of nursing said, that's where the 5-day discharge letter comes in. The resident said, "They came one day and said, 'We're moving you,' without any warning. I said no, and the administrator said he would kick me out, so I moved." Moving on to the third aspect examined in the study, residents' perceived staff retaliation. Whether it's delays in care, neglect, psychological abuse, being yelled at, cursed at, mocked, or receiving silent treatment, being confronted aggressively, physical abuse, forcing residents to do things against their will, harassment through intrusive one-on-one 24/7 supervision, and other right violations. In one nursing home, a resident who chose to remain anonymous told a licensed practical nurse that something seemed off with her medications. The LPN then became mean to her, and one day, the LPN came behind her, leaned over to give them a hug, but then whispered in her ear, "She could beat the shit out of me, and no one would know how she did it." The resident said, "I was terrified." The resident was afraid to say anything, but finally had to when she noticed multiple medication discrepancies. In one nursing home, a resident alleged that an agency staff took a towel with feces and placed it on her nose. The reason? She did not want the aide to use paper towels to clean her. She wanted her to use a towel. Another nursing home, a resident said, "A while back, I had to poop on myself because there was a wash basin with urine in it sitting on my toilet. I had to urgently poop, but first I had to urgently move the basin filled with urine, and it took too long, and I ended up pooping on myself." How devastating that can be. After cleaning himself up, he took the wash basin, placed it on the desk at the nurse's station, and when he was asked about it, he told staff why he did that. Shortly after, he smelled urine in his bedroom for 2 days. Eventually, he found the basin with urine in it inside his bedside drawer. "Can you believe it?" he asked. The fourth aspect examined in my study was actual or confirmed staff retaliation. And it was manifested whether it's verbal and psychological abuse in the forms of harassment, intimidation, yelling, and cursing, or physical abuse. For example, while in bed, staff forcefully pulled a resident's neck forward towards her feet, causing pain and a C2 displacement. And this was physical retaliation. And the reason is because the resident who received her medications, the medications fell and she couldn't find them. And a nurse who heard about it went ballistic and abused her in that way. Or in another nursing home, a staffer grabbed a resident's pinky finger and bent it backwards towards his wrist. In another nursing home, there were shower scalding and retaliation. And then there were a few cases of what is called reflexive or slapping and punching in reaction to a resident's rejection of undignified and unskilled care. We're going to return to that issue later. Here, I'm going to share some forms of retaliation that were identified by Ombudsman in my quality improvement project that resulted in the separate report, A Bridge Over Scary Water. Dozens of forms of retaliation were identified and interviewed with Ombudsman. A portion of them were overlapping and consistent with the ones found in my study. And yet there were others that were not identified in my study. So I wanted to share them with you here. The retaliatory act spanned a wide range of circumstances, right violations, neglect of care, abuse, different forms of abuse, whether it's verbal, psychological, physical, and retaliatory threats, including threats of and retaliatory discharges, and what is called hospital dumping. The forms of retaliation, including a sudden shift in a staff behavior, the cold shoulder type attitude, silent treatment. One ombudsman said that silence is another way to retaliate when they don't say anything, when the staffer does not say anything. Or passive defiance, waiting to meet a person's needs, kind of I'll show them type thing. And the ombudsman said that it's not black and white, but the resident feels it. Other forms of retaliation included ignoring requests for assistance or delaying assistance, not responding to call-outs or delays in responding to call-outs, moving call-outs out of reach, so you cannot call for help when you need it, turning call-outs off and leaving, so the call-out will go on, the staff member will arrive at the room, will turn off the call-out, will leave without providing care, saying I'll be back with no intention of coming back, not responding to residents' phone calls after screening their caller ID. In one case, a staffer left the door open at night against the resident's wishes, knowing that the residents can't shut the door. Or administering antipsychotic medications as a form of chemical restraint. There are also, so you can see how a subgroup of retaliatory acts are neglectful of care. One of the most common ways is that neglect of care, said one ombudsman. For example, not providing incontinence care or assistance with showers. Verbal retaliation could be rude comments, disparaging remarks, demeaning words, belittling. One ombudsman said they're pretty good about belittling. Here's an example. You would make my job so much easier if you pee in your brief. How demeaning, how humiliating that statement, how devastating that statement could be when the residents hear it. Or gaslighting. A common example is he is saying or documenting he refused, such as refused a shower or refusing assistance with changing, etc. And the ombudsman described it as an outright lie. I think you have dementia. I think you don't remember things. Or using elder speak communication style in retaliation. Honey, sweetie, good girl, which is very demeaning and hurtful for older adults, which should be treated as adults, not as children. Or confronting residents, including aggressively. Why did you complain about me? Telling residents to expect retaliation. For example, one staff member was quoted saying to a resident, "Now I'm not going to help you." Or threats of retaliation. You better not ring that light again. You better watch it. Regarding threats, residents were fearful that staff are going to drug them. If you don't like it here, we'll help you find another place to live. If you have bad behaviors, we're going to send you out. And one ombudsman highlighted that the fear of being sent out for behaviors is real. Physical retaliation, rough care. One ombudsman described how staff member retaliated against a resident by wiping the resident so hard, literally scraping her, because she called on how abusive they were. The ombudsman said that the resident was like a whistleblower on all the corruption and the different things that were happening in that care home. Another form of physical retaliation is when the resident was slapped or dropped on the floor on purpose during transfer. And here are a couple of signs of physical retaliation, which may include bruises and marks on the resident. Of course, it could be for different reasons, but that was described as one possibility in physical retaliation, one outcome of physical retaliation. This incident involved a woman in late stages of dementia, and it was captured on camera footage. An aide asked her to move. She didn't. In response, the aide intentionally ran over her foot with a wheelchair. I asked specifically about it, and the ombudsman confirmed it was absolutely intentional. The ombudsman watched that video. The abusive act caused the resident to cry. The ombudsman said, I'm sure it was very painful. Here's another incident of physical retaliation um, for literally nothing, for no reason. An aide told a resident in advanced stage of dementia, I'm here to wake you up. The resident just stared at her for a few seconds. The ombudsman said she was not responding, not doing anything. Very typical manifestation, referring to her dementia. The aide said, why do you look at me with that damn ass look on your face? Very quickly, the ombudsman said, things got escalated from there. The aide threw poise pads at her face. The woman pulled back, and the aide gave her 3 or 4 more hits with the pads. Or retaliation by multiple staff simultaneously. A woman was financially exploited when she sold food stamps to an aide. She reported it, and then the entire unit retaliated against her, including the nurse. Speaking about nurses in role modeling or leadership positions that all staff members follow suit. Um, they wouldn't give her ice and utensil. They wouldn't give her bed sheets. The ombudsman brought it to the attention of the administrator, and the aide was removed from the unit, and the retaliation alleviated. And the ombudsman explained that the staff could not do it anymore because they knew if they do it now, they're going to catch me right now. Another form of retaliation was described as cares in pairs business when you complain. And the consequences for residents here are 3 examples of those consequences. It feels very much like they don't believe you or not getting the care timely because it is hard enough to find one staff free. Finding 2 at the same time makes it even longer for you to get care. And it was described as intimidating for the residents, that cares in pairs business, when 2 staff members are assigned to care for you. Or another form of retaliation was described when staffers record a resident, often with demeaning and abusive content, and then posting it to social media. The ombudsman said the staff have also been known to record residents and use that against them. To me, that's retaliation. She explained their behavior. So people with dementia who might be having a bad day, we're going to record you to make fun of you and later show that to you and then put it on social media. If you're interested in this relatively new form of abuse of residents, you can watch my webinar on this phenomena where staff take photos and videos of residents with demeaning and abusive content and then post it to different social media platforms such as Snapchat, Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter or X. So we're in the midst of a study on that, but there's already a webinar that can provide you some insights into this phenomenon. Another form of retaliation was described by Ombudsman, taking or breaking residents' belongings. Staff may retaliate by putting away an object a resident wants, whether it's an item the individual wants next to them at night, providing them that comfort or the need for some object that they need to go through the night in a good way. One housekeeper allegedly took a resident's set of forks, knives, and mugs. Or staff dropped a resident's tablet computer and shattered it. Then they said that they put the blame on the resident. They said he broke it, and they told him, now you can't go crying to your mommy. Why did they do it? Well, he had talked to his family on the video chat, and then the family reported something to the administrator, and it got back to the staff. Other forms of retaliation identified by Ombudsman were exclusion, such as not including a person in activities, events, and outings, pitting a resident against another, such as a roommate, saying negative things about a resident staff don't like. For example, starting rumors. She's not nice, she's a bully, she smells funny. Taking away smoking rights, taking away your green pass, bedroom change, roommate assignments, which was described as one of the biggest fears of residents, showing up and saying, you're out of here, which, the room is their home. or giving a person a terrible, what was described as a terrible roommate in retaliation, or making residents feel miserable. For example, not providing showers, so they'll want to leave. So they will want to leave the care home. Other forms of retaliation identified by Ombudsman in that separate project reported in my report, A Bridge Over Scary Water. Compromising camera installed in the bedroom, whether it's blocking the view, putting, a sweater on it, unplugging it, etc. Retaliatory discharges, such as to the lowest performing nursing home in the county, or a discharge after the state survey agency issued a deficiency citation for this specific individual residents regarding their care. And it was done just to get rid of the person so it's no longer a problem. Or retaliation after a resident won a discharge appeal. And how they retaliated? Well, they installed a surveillance camera in the hallway pointing directly into the resident's bedroom. Not only this is harassment, it's also a privacy violation. Or what one ombudsman described as a hospital dump job, refusing to let the resident return from the hospital. Or retaliatory transfer to a psychiatric hospital. One ombudsman described retaliation after contacting the ombudsman. Whether it's not giving care for longer periods of time, or staff would be rude and give them the cold shoulder. The resident told the ombudsman, because you and I did such and such together, life is really hell for me now. And they're like, I don't want you to do this for me anymore. The staff told the resident, this is what you get for bringing outside people in, calling the ombudsman. Or retaliation after contacting the state survey agency. An administrator questioned the resident why she called the health department. Why are you harassing us? That's the administrator telling the resident, why are you harassing us? The ombudsman considered it as intimidating to the resident. And the ombudsman, with permission, intervened and told the administrator, look, man, you can't go badger them about why they're calling the health department. You can say, I want you to come to me before you do that, but you have to acknowledge that that's their right. The ombudsman explained, it's just a direct conversation with the administrator. The administrator admitted not approaching it the best way, so that intervention was successful. Ombudsman also dedicated a lot of time talking about the important distinction between subtle versus blatant retaliation. Blatant, that is more observable, more evident, more, something that is more obvious retaliation. But I should say that the demarcation line is not always straightforward, right? It's not black and white. For example, a slow response to call-out can be subtle, simply ignoring it, or done in a blatant, evident, observable way. For example, one staff member telling a resident, you think that was long? Watch me now. And one ombudsman was very eloquent about describing this distinction. Where is the line, he asked. What's subtle to us, subtle to you, might not be subtle to me. So there's just a lot of variability with that. And he gave an example. That good morning might be what one of my residents thrives on every day. And all of a sudden, it's just derailed their whole morning when the staff member no longer greets the resident by saying good morning. So what is subtle, right? This ombudsman with over 30 years of experience in this role, very experienced, very skilled, very effective ombudsman, said, describe what staff are doing with subtle retaliation. They're right on the line, she said. They don't cross it. They're on it when they are retaliating. It's not noticeable. You can't actually see it. They know exactly what they're doing. It's on the tip edge of proving that you're doing it. The resident feel it, but you can't see it. Many ombudsmen thought that subtle retaliation is more common than blatant retaliation. One of them said, the most common ways are tiny and small. It's the eye roll. It's the hands on the hips. What do you want this time when they walk in the bedroom? It's the extra 20 minutes they're going to take to shower you to answer your call light, because they're going to show you who is in charge. Another ombudsman said, I feel like retaliation that is quite subtle is the most prevalent. But several ombudsmen also emphasized that the subtle retaliation is a lot harder to prove. One of them said, some of the subtle forms of retaliation could be particularly harmful, especially for residents who are primarily bedbound. Here are examples of subtle retaliation as described by Ombudsman. Long response times to call lights, late with assistance to the bathroom, not changing the person or delays in changing soiled adult depends, withholding medications, being skipped or given last, late with meals, snacks, or water, leaving food tray by a person who they know is unable to cut things up, pretending to forget their food. Oh, did I forget your dessert? Not emptying urinals at bedside. How demeaning this can be. How hurtful this could be. Other examples of subtle retaliation were, so here Ombudsman talked about retaliation that could be done without words. There are a lot of nonverbal ways which are very hard to prove, but the residents know. They know when someone has got an attitude with them, they can tell. So subtle retaliation without words could be expressed through tone of voice or just your demeanor. If your arms are crossed, your face looks angry, you're not going to want to ask someone something if they look mean, nasty, and angry. So all you need is a look, right? Or standing over their bed with their hands on their hips. One ombudsman described how just the looks could be a form of subtle retaliation. He described a resident saying, "Oh my God, if I bring something up, you should see the looks I get. It's like the daggers." That term, if looks could kill, like don't even think about doing anything. The ombudsman added, staff do not realize how much residents pick up on that, which is another example of why we need to ensure that all staff members receive adequate staff training, not only about residents' rights, abuse, neglect, but also about fear retaliation and actual retaliation. One ombudsman described subtle retaliation without words, which went in the following way: walking in and giving me dirty looks when I ask a basic question or when I ask for a basic thing. The evil eye, as my grandmother used to call it, said the ombudsman. Or bringing your meal but placing it out of reach. Placing the call-light out of reach. Walking by a person, completely ignoring them, as if they were a chair. How an aide puts the medications on the nightstand. This could be retaliation. If they bang it on the nightstand, that speaks loudly. How they close the door to your room when they leave. Or how they hold you when they help you into the bathroom. Blatant retaliation, examples, retaliatory threats of retaliation, or retaliatory verbal or physical abuse, or retaliatory discharges. Isolating residents, especially someone loud and vocal. Put them in a common room and lock their brakes. Take them to the room, remove their call bell, and shut the door. Or without saying a word, shoving a resident to bed and glaring at her. The resident said, "The CNA just glared at me. I didn't dare say a word." Or a staff member telling a resident, "I am going to unplug your oxygen." How terrifying this could be. Moving on to the last aspect examined in my study, that is emotional or psychological consequences due to fear of retaliation, threats of retaliation, and actual retaliation. A wide range of consequences was identified. While the severity varied, many suffered tremendously and were emotionally devastated. These incidents caused residents to experience frustration, anxiety, fear, anger, sadness, depression, and helplessness. One resident said, "It brings anxiety, it brings depression that I can't speak up for myself." Residents felt disregarded, ignored, belittled, infantilized, humiliated, and dehumanized. Some residents felt isolated and trapped. One of them said, "I feel like a prisoner in jail." In this incident, a resident was worried all day about what will happen at night from a particular aide, and specifically about abrupt repositioning by the aide at night. The resident said, When I get up in the morning, my biggest concern is what will happen in 12 hours when I go to bed at night. The resident declined to identify the aide, being fearful of retaliation. Residents worried about their security and safety. One resident said, I got scared the whole day after staff verbal abuse. Residents were terrified after staff threats of physical abuse and violence. One resident had terror in their face when recounting a registered nurse's verbal abuse and physically injurious abuse. She said, they almost broke me in half, physically. Some feared for their lives. Some residents were scared to death. Residents experienced helplessness due to inability to defend themselves, worrying about the safety of other residents, such as a roommate or employees. One resident, we'll call him Resident A, with moderate cognitive impairment, had a bowel movement accident. Resident B stated that a CNA responded by screaming at Resident A for at least 10 minutes. God damn it, man. You're too old for this shit. I can't believe you're shitting yourself again. You're a F baby, man. Resident A, the victim, was so angry and visibly shaking after the verbal abuse. Residents who are cognitively intact are worried about residents who are cognitively impaired. In this case, a resident who was cognitively intact stated that he was left soiled in urine and bowel movement for over 30 minutes. Out of frustration of reporting issues or complaining, I prefer to stay quiet to prevent retaliation. My complaining is mostly for those who cannot advocate for themselves, because while being cognitive and verbal, I get this kind of treatment. It saddens me even thinking about the kind of treatment those who cannot speak and are not cognitive are getting. Physical retaliation caused physical pain. A resident was pushed forcefully in her bed, causing a C2 dislocation requiring hospitalization. And again, having one's pinky finger bent backwards towards the wrist until the resident screamed in pain. Being scolded during a shower. One resident alleged that a staff member banged his head in retaliation against the side rail, and the staffer did it really hard, and then he or she then took a urinal and smashed it against his genitals over and over really hard. In one case, an aide pressed a metal tray against the resident's face, causing swelling and redness beneath the eye. What happened in that incident is that the staffer came with milk, but when the resident saw the milk, it had some coloring in it, and the residents thought that the milk was no longer good, or that they preferred not to use it, and they pushed the tray away, and the tray fell. In retaliatory reaction, the aide pressed that metal tray against the resident's face. Or being punched in the face. There were several incidents where staffers physically retaliated against often residents in advanced stage of dementia, causing bloody nose and a mouth, and what is called reflexive retaliation. Here, there was a resident with moderate impaired cognition. The resident was masturbating in a small room connected to the nursing area. An RN went up to him, grabbed his penis, and screamed, "If you don't stop that, I'm going to rip that thing off." Staff witness said that the resident screamed because the RN grabbed it so hard. So I shared these findings of the study and the emotional, psychological, and physical consequences of this phenomenon on residents with Mairead Painter, the Connecticut State Long-Term Care Ombudsman Program. And I asked her, I said, you went through the list of emotional consequences identified in the study. As a state ombudsman, what is your reaction to that in general? She said, it is sickening, and it just shows we need to do a lot more education and outreach. And I should recognize Mairead, who funded that separate quality improvement project that resulted in the report, A Bridge Over Scary Water, which I will share the findings from in our separate presentation during your annual conference. So we're reaching here the last stretch of this presentation. In conclusion of my study, this phenomenon represents a source of resident suffering and harm, which is inadequately addressed and understudied. The voice of many residents remains silenced. It is time to break the silence, literally, and dangerous normalization of this phenomenon. And Cheryl Hannon, the Minnesota State Long-Term Care Ombudsman, said in response to incidents of retaliation against residents, "This is a human rights issue. Vulnerable adults with complex medical issues are being retaliated against for the simple act of speaking up. Someone needs to take the lead here and stop the practice." So at a very high level, we're going to get to it more in the separate presentation. Here are some practical implications from my study. We need to educate residents about their rights, and also families, of course. Educate families about residents' rights. One ombudsman said, "Know your rights. That's really important." Making sure that they know their rights is super important, said another ombudsman. The more familiar the residents are with their rights, the more empowered they become. And not just take the staff member's word for it. And not only hearing residents' rights, but understanding it, really absorbing those residents' rights. And I included a link to a fact sheet that I mentioned earlier by the Consumer Voice. And there's a section there on page 2 that is entitled Know Your Rights. So whether it's a nursing home residents' rights for dignity and respect, whether it's the rights for privacy, whether it's private conversations with a friend, with a family inside a bedroom, or with the family over the phone, or with the ombudsman when the ombudsman is outside the nursing home. The right to be free from abuse and neglect, the right to voice grievances without reprisal, discrimination and retaliation, and without fear of retaliation. So knowing the rights is the absolute basis for empowering residents and giving them the knowledge that they can use to self-advocate for themselves, of course, with many other strategies and supports. So we need to develop, deliver, and evaluate educational programs. And those programs are needed for residents, for family members and friends, for all employees, direct and indirect staff members, grievance officers, managers, and owners of care homes. We need to ensure that long-term care ombudsman programs and ombudsman representatives are fully educated about this issue, and educate state surveyors, law enforcement, emergency medical services, adult protective services workers in states where they have jurisdiction to investigate abuse, neglect, and right violations in nursing homes and other care homes, and Medicaid fraud control units. We need to empower and encourage residents to speak up and develop clear and confidential reporting mechanisms that protect residents' anonymity, thereby alleviating fears of retaliation. Even I know from my quality improvement project, from speaking with 50 ombudsmen across the country, they're telling that many times residents don't have a secure and private way to communicate with the outside world, whether it's family or ombudsman or other advocates. Yes, many residents have a cell phone, but others don't. And even if they have a cell phone, staff may be hovering by the door listening to their conversation, so residents won't speak up. But we need to be aware that in certain situations, encouraging residents to speak up, even anonymously, without strong and timely protections in place, may sometimes end up in harming them. A staff member said in one nursing home, the staff were not stupid and could figure it out. That is, could figure it out who said it, even if it was anonymous. For example, in a small care home or a unique nature of a complaint. In terms of policy implications, again, this is really high level. CMS needs to strengthen awareness, oversight, protection, and deterrence and enforcement of this phenomenon. It needs to launch campaigns to educate residents and families about residents' rights and reporting procedures, including mandatory reporters. CMS needs to strengthen identification, surveyors' identification of psychosocial harm, and there's a CMS memo about it. And to strongly implement the reasonable person concept in terms of guidance to state surveyors, especially in mid to late stages of dementia, because many of the victims of retaliation, such as reflexive retaliation, during personal care, are residents with dementia. So how would a reasonable person would experience and perceive that situation if they were experiencing it in that same situation? Because many in advanced stages of dementia may not be able to voice those concerns or remember details of incidents. We need to centrally track all violations, citations related to this phenomenon, and we need to launch a national campaign to address fear of retaliation and actual retaliation. And I want to highlight Connecticut's law from 2012 that requires annual in-service training to all staff members on fear of retaliation in nursing homes. And I believe that other states need to pass a similar law, and while doing it, remembering assisted living residences and ensuring that the law will apply to this sector where these incidents occur as well. And I want to share with you my report, a separate report, a third report. It's called Silenced: Residents' Fear of Retaliation in 40 Illinois Nursing Homes, which was funded by the Alliance for Community Services in that state. And the report was recently instrumental in the passage of a bill which will take effect on January 1st, 2026, making Illinois the second state after Connecticut to require annual in-service training or retaliation in nursing homes. And a couple of words about the assisted living sector. One ombudsman told me, and we haven't even gotten to the horrible world of adult care facilities in that state. It includes assisted living residences. Just the idea that it lacks so many regulations. And she added that people in assisted living don't think they have any rights. There is a Bill of Rights, but nobody really explains it to them. And she highlighted the need to educate residents in assisted living about their rights. Here's an example of retaliation in assisted living. A person living with paralysis of all four limbs became upset about staff handling of his mechanical lift during transfer. She said that she's going to report it to management. The staff who was by the door overheard it and responded by physically threatening, harassing, and humiliating the person. The Minnesota Department of Health was informed about this incident, investigated it, and substantiated it as emotional abuse. Ombudsman also highlighted that fear of retaliatory discharge is common in assisted living residences. And one reason was the lack of or weak discharge rights in many state regulations. The ombudsman said they don't have a right to appeal a discharge, such as a 30-day notice, or using the tactic of fine line of level of care. You really are getting close to that level of care. If you complain, we may have to suggest a move, or giving a 30-day discharge notice for any other reason. And the ombudsman, frustrated, said, it can't be just for any other reason. We all know that there's 6 criteria in federal nursing regulations for discharge, for wrongful, for discharges. And so where is the regulatory standards in assisted living residences across the country? One ombudsman said it's very scary. They feel like they are a step from being homeless and that they are defenseless, especially in care home for people with dementia and assisted living. Here's an example of a couple who lived in a senior home in Minnesota. An 84-year-old woman with pulmonary conditions so severe that her doctor ordered her to avoid smoke. When she complained about other residents smoking, which the care home rules prohibited, the administrator threatened to evict them for misbehaving and stirring up trouble. This is called looping, what Irving Goffman in the early 60s in his book Asylums, when he studied total institutions, this is exactly what he described as looping. You create an impossible living conditions for the person, and when they complain about it, you retaliate against them. You place the source of the problem, you collapse it into the person, and retaliate and blame them for it. We were petrified, she said. We were being labeled as troublemakers and had nowhere else to go. The couple could no longer live with the threat and the breathing difficulties from the smoke exposure. They eventually decided to move to a different assisted living. And the woman asked, how would you like to be forced out of the home where you lived for 12 years? In conclusion, Richard Mollot, the director of the Long-Term Care Community Coalition in New York City, he said, that there is a need to create an environment where residents feel secure reporting abuse is critical for building trust, promoting accountability, and maintaining the overall safety and well-being of senior care residents. And I'm going to close here with three quotes of two residents being direct quotes, and then one of them being quoted by another, the Commissioner of Health of Connecticut. So Mary said, "If you are afraid of anything, I don't care how little or how big it is, you should be able to tell somebody, whether it be for yourself or for someone else." And Carol Rosenwald, who was the driving force behind the first Connecticut Voices Forum in 1997, said, "None of this will happen overnight. You must hold on to your ideas and always have the courage to speak your mind." And Amy Porter, the commissioner of the Connecticut Department of Aging and Disability Services, said a few years ago that Carol envisioned a time when the voices of nursing home residents would be heard beyond the walls of their care homes. So I want to thank you for taking the time to watch this presentation. I hope it was useful for you, and I'm looking forward to continued dialogue during your annual conference.